She only wanted to do her job with dignity, but one neighbor's cruel suspicion turned her world into a nightmare. In moments, her skin color became her so-called crime, and the threat of handcuffs loomed closer. Yet what happened next was more than confrontation. It became a test of justice, courage, and truth. Would resilience win? Amina had always believed in the quiet dignity of work. To the world, she might have looked like just another maid in a pressed uniform, walking briskly down the sidewalk toward the grand house where she worked each morning. But to her, every step was a reminder of how far she had come, and how much further she intended to go. She carried more than cleaning supplies and grocery bags. She carried the hopes of her children, the sacrifices of her mother, and the lessons of her grandmother, who had scrubbed floors in homes where her name was never remembered. Amina had promised herself that her story would be different. The house she worked in wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity. Her employer, a wealthy businessman, treated her with a respect she hadn't always known in this line of work. He valued her honesty, her sharp attention to detail, and the way she carried herself with grace. To Amina, this was proof that dignity could exist even in a world that often tried to strip it away. Every morning, she sang softly to herself as she tidied rooms flooded with sunlight, polishing silverware and folding linens with the kind of care most people reserved for their own possessions. She did it not because anyone was watching, but because she believed work done with pride was never wasted. At home, life was simple but full of love. Amina's 2 children waited eagerly for the evenings when she returned, bringing leftover bread or fruit from her employer's kitchen. She told them stories about resilience, how storms eventually passed, how the roots of a tree held strong no matter how fierce the winds. Her dream was clear: to give them a life where their worth would never be questioned, where their skin would not be seen as a mark against them but as a banner of strength. Yet, beneath the calm rhythm of her days, there were shadows she could not ignore. The neighborhood she worked in was quiet and manicured, but she had felt the stares before. The lingering looks from neighbors who wondered why a black woman walked these streets every morning. Some didn't greet her, others crossed to the opposite sidewalk. She noticed, but she carried on, refusing to let suspicion or prejudice dictate her steps. Still, there were moments that unsettled her. A neighbor peering through curtains a little too long. A muttered word she couldn't quite catch but knew wasn't kind. She brushed it aside with the strength she had learned all her life. Endure, push forward, don't let bitterness settle in. For Amina, survival had never been enough. She wanted to rise, and though her uniform said Maid, her spirit said something greater. Mother. Dreamer. Builder of a future where dignity could never be stolen. She didn't know it yet, but the quiet suspicion brewing around her was about to erupt. One person's prejudice, one phone call, and one assumption would soon challenge everything she believed about justice, resilience, and the value of her life. Because sometimes, the greatest tests come not when you're expecting a fight, but when you're simply trying to live in peace. The morning had begun like any other, with Amina balancing her broom and bucket, humming a tune that her children loved. But today, something felt off. As she stepped onto the polished walkway leading to the house, she noticed a familiar neighbor lingering by the fence. The man's eyes followed her with a cold intensity that made her stomach tighten. She tried to smile, offered a polite nod, but it was ignored. She moved quickly inside, hoping the warmth of her employer's home would drown out the unease. But minutes later, a sharp knock at the door froze her mid-step. When she opened it, she found not a friendly visitor, but 2 uniformed police officers standing solemnly, their expressions unreadable. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about suspicious activity in the neighborhood," one said. Amina blinked, confused. "Suspicious activity? I live and work here. I've been here for years." The officer's gaze was polite but firm. "We just need to ask a few questions." Her heart began to pound. She could feel the blood rushing to her ears, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured for them to come in. Fear surged. Not just for herself, but for the fragile sense of security she had worked so hard to maintain. She thought of her children waiting at home, of her mother's words echoing in her mind. Stand tall, no matter what they throw at you. But standing tall felt impossible as the officers questioned her, repeating accusations she had never imagined facing. Whispers from a neighbor had spiraled into this, a false alarm that threatened to strip away her dignity in a single moment. Minutes felt like hours. Each question, each pause chipped at her calm. The neighbor had called the police on her without a second thought, assuming guilt based on nothing more than skin color. Amina's mind raced. How could someone look at me and think I was a criminal? Anger flared alongside the fear, burning deep in her chest. Suddenly, The tension broke with the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the front door. The officers turned, and so did Amina. There, striding up the walkway, was her employer. The millionaire businessman she respected and admired, his presence commanding and steady. "What's going on here?" His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority. The officers hesitated, unsure how to respond. The neighbor, now visible behind the fence, froze, caught in the act of prejudice. Amina felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this nightmare wasn't going to end in humiliation after all. Her employer's gaze swept the scene, taking in every detail: the tension in Amina's shoulders, the stiffness of the officers, the neighbor's guilty posture. He stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Amina and the world that had turned against her. "This is my employee," he said firmly. "She is a valued member of this household, and she has done nothing wrong. I expect that to be clear to everyone here." The neighbor sputtered, searching for words, but none came. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of injustice hung thick in the air, a suffocating fog that threatened to smother hope. Amina's chest tightened, but she drew strength from the unwavering presence beside her. Yet the battle was far from over. Even with her employer's defense, whispers and judgment lingered. Some neighbors shook their heads, muttering under their breath. Others stared openly, their assumptions unspoken but palpable. Amina felt the sting of prejudice, a reminder that justice was not always immediate, and that courage required more than one act of defense. It required persistence. As the officers finally left, the neighbor retreating with a mix of anger and embarrassment, Amina stood still, trying to process what had just happened. Relief and lingering fear collided, leaving her momentarily paralyzed. She realized that what she had faced was more than a false accusation. It was a test of resilience, a moment that demanded she confront not only others' assumptions, but her own self-doubt. She retreated to a quiet corner of the house, taking a deep breath as her employer closed the door behind them. "You handled yourself well," he said, his tone measured but kind. "But it's not just about today. It's about showing the world and yourself the strength you already carry." Amina's mind replayed the events over and over. Each step she had taken, each question she had answered, had been a thread in a web of tension, weaving together fear, courage, and dignity. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had survived the immediate threat. But the fight for respect, for recognition, for fairness in a world quick to judge by appearance, was far from over. That evening, as she returned home to her children, she carried more than groceries and lessons in patience. She carried a renewed understanding of what resilience truly meant. The injustice she faced could not erase her value, nor could it define her. And yet, she knew that the coming days would test her further, pushing her to confront systemic prejudice, personal humiliation, and the very limits of her courage. The neighborhood seemed quieter now, but Amina sensed the undercurrent of judgment still lingering. Like a storm gathering on the horizon, she understood that the true test was not in surviving one incident, but in maintaining integrity, strength, and hope in a world that often sought to deny them. As she tucked her children into bed, their faces calm and trusting, she whispered to herself what her grandmother had once said: "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is standing tall in the face of it." Tomorrow would bring another day, another challenge. But tonight, Amina allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had faced injustice, and though shaken, she was unbroken. The question that lingered, however, gnawed at her. When the world assumes the worst of you, how far will you go to show the truth? She didn't know the answer yet, but she was about to find out in ways that would demand every ounce of her strength, wisdom, and moral courage. The next morning, the tension that had hovered like a storm finally broke. Amina returned to work with a quiet determination, each step measured, her mind replaying the humiliation and fear from the previous day. The neighborhood felt heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting for her next move. She knew whispers would follow. Skeptical glances would linger, but today, she refused to be invisible. As she walked through the front gate, she noticed the neighbor again, the same man whose assumptions had sparked the nightmare. This time, he didn't hide behind his fence. Instead, he stepped forward, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with resentment. The air grew thick with unspoken hostility, and Amina's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing she had to face this moment head-on. "Back again," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. "Think you belong here?" Amina's grip tightened on the cleaning cart. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to ignore the provocation and avoid escalating the situation. But this wasn't just about her dignity anymore. It was about every assumption, every stereotype, every moment of injustice she had endured quietly. She realized that silence would not protect her. It would empower the very prejudice that had threatened to define her. Before she could respond, a sharp voice rang out behind her. Her employer emerged, eyes narrowing at the neighbor. "This is my employee," he said, his tone firm, almost dangerous. "And I will not tolerate harassment or false accusations in my household." The neighbor scoffed. But Amina noticed the subtle hesitation in his posture. He knew the dynamic had shifted. The powerful presence beside her gave her courage, but she knew this was still her fight. As they entered the house, the tension escalated further. A delivery driver arrived moments later, causing a scene that drew the neighbor's attention. He jumped to conclusions once again, his fingers twitching toward a phone as if to call the police on the spot. Amina felt her pulse quicken, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was the peak, the moment where she would either crumble or rise. She stopped, took a deep breath, and allowed herself a brief moment to reflect. Everything she had learned, every story of resilience from her mother and grandmother, every lesson in courage and dignity, converged in this instant. She had faced humiliation, false accusations, and systemic prejudice before, but never like this, where the eyes of her children, her community, and the world seemed to weigh on her simultaneously. The neighbor raised his phone, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed frozen. Time stretched, each second amplified by the pounding of her heart. He was about to summon authority to validate his own assumptions, to strip away her dignity again, to make her powerless. Then Amina acted. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, her voice steady and unwavering. "You don't get to decide my worth," she said. The words were soft, but carried a power that cut through the tension like a blade. "You don't know my life, my sacrifices, or my children. Your assumptions end here." The neighbor faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For the first time, he had no words that could defend his prejudice. Around them, the air seemed to shift, the invisible weight of injustice lifting, replaced by the undeniable presence of courage. Her employer nodded approvingly. "She speaks the truth. Your accusations were baseless, and your judgment was flawed. You will not define her story, nor will you define mine." Amina felt a surge of adrenaline, a mixture of triumph and release. The humiliation that had threatened to crush her was now powerless against her courage. Each word she spoke was a reclamation of dignity, a declaration that no act of bias could ever erase her humanity. But the climax was not yet over. The neighbor, still red-faced with anger, muttered a final attempt at intimidation. Amina met his gaze directly, unwavering, her presence commanding. "This ends now," she said firmly. "Not tomorrow, not next week, now." At that moment, something shifted, not just in her neighbor, but within herself. The fear that had clung to her like a shadow dissolved, replaced by clarity and power. She realized that the true victory wasn't merely in being defended by her employer. It was in standing tall and speaking her truth when it mattered most. The neighbor retreated, his shoulders slumping, a silent acknowledgement that he could not win this battle. The officers, who had arrived again in cautious response to a neighbor's call, observed in quiet respect as Amina handled herself with dignity, her employer silently supporting her from behind. Amina felt the full weight of the lesson she had been learning all along. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. Integrity is not about waiting for someone else to defend you. It is about claiming your own space, asserting your worth, and refusing to let prejudice dictate your life. By the time the moment ended, a strange calm settled over her. The storm had passed, but its impact had transformed her. She had faced injustice head-on, experienced the full force of humiliation and bias, and emerged stronger, unbroken, and empowered. As she finally returned to her work, sweeping floors and straightening furniture with practiced precision, Amina's mind replayed the events like a vivid film. Each choice she had made, each word she had spoken, had been a step toward reclaiming not just her dignity, but the dignity of every person who had ever been judged unfairly. The climax of her struggle had revealed a fundamental truth. While others may try to define your worth, it is your courage, your choices, and your resilience that ultimately write your story. The question now was no longer if she could survive prejudice, but how she would use this newfound strength to inspire change, protect her family, and shape her community. And in that quiet realization, Amina whispered to herself a promise she had long carried in her heart. "I will not be invisible. I will not be silenced. I will rise, and I will show the world what strength looks like." The neighbor's final glance lingered like a shadow at the edge of her vision, a reminder that prejudice never fully disappears. But Amina knew that the power to confront it, to meet it with courage and truth, was hers. She had reached the pinnacle of her test, and now, every action that followed would carry the weight of this victory. With her employer's quiet support and her own unwavering resolve, Amina stepped fully into her role not just as a worker or a mother, but as a symbol of resilience, integrity, and justice. She had faced the storm, and she had won, not because the world had changed, but because she had changed, rising to meet the challenge with every ounce of her strength and heart. And as she stood in that house, heart still racing but spirit unshaken, one truth crystallized in her mind, ready to carry her into the next chapter. When the world underestimates you, your courage becomes the proof of your worth, and no one can take that away. The days after the confrontation passed in a strange, almost surreal rhythm. Amina returned to her routines, sweeping floors, dusting furniture, and preparing meals with the same meticulous care as always. But something fundamental had shifted within her. Each motion, once automatic, now carried a quiet but resolute pride. She moved through her world with the knowledge that she had faced injustice and emerged unbroken. Not only intact, but stronger, wiser, and more determined. Her employer noticed the subtle change too. He offered fewer words of encouragement this time, not because he had nothing to say, but because words were no longer needed. Amina had proven herself in the crucible of adversity, and her confidence radiated without effort. She was no longer merely the employee who does her job well. She had become a living example of dignity, resilience, and moral courage. Even the neighbor who had called the police seemed diminished in her eyes. The shadow of his prejudice remained, but it no longer carried the power to define her. Each time she caught a glimpse of his judgmental stare, she met it with calm resolve instead of fear. The incident had taught her that courage was not just a one-time act. It was a state of being. It was the decision to uphold your integrity every day, even when the world doubts or misunderstands you. Amina's children noticed the shift as well. They asked fewer questions about the police, the whispers in the neighborhood, and the tense stares from strangers. Instead, they watched her with admiration and curiosity, inspired by the strength she displayed so naturally. The lessons she had once taught them through stories and bedtime conversations were now embodied in her actions. Her resilience was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, observable, and powerful. Friends and extended family who heard of the incident reacted with awe and pride. Messages flooded in, some from those who had experienced similar injustices, others from people who simply recognized the courage required to face bias without anger or retaliation. Amina's story became more than a personal victory. It became a beacon, a quiet yet potent reminder that dignity and moral fortitude could withstand the harshest tests. But perhaps the most profound impact was internal. Amina had spent much of her life contending with the subtle erosion of self-worth that comes from living in a world quick to judge by appearance. The neighbors' assumptions and the police confrontation had exposed raw, uncomfortable truths about society, but they also forced her to confront her own fears, hesitations, and doubts. In the heat of crisis, she had discovered a well of courage she had not fully recognized, an inner strength that no outsider could ever diminish. She realized that justice was not always immediate, and recognition was not always forthcoming. Yet these truths did not diminish the value of her actions. Instead, they amplified them. Courage and integrity were not measured by applause or validation. They were measured by the choices made in moments when it would have been easier to remain silent or bow under pressure. Amina began to see her work in a broader light. What had once been just a job now carried layers of meaning beyond cleaning or caregiving. Each day became an opportunity to model resilience, to subtly challenge assumptions, and to remind herself and others that human dignity could not be taken by fear, bias, or circumstance. The house she worked in transformed from a site of labor into a sanctuary of personal triumph, a place where morality, strength, and inspiration intersected in her lived experience. The neighborhood, too, shifted, though quietly, imperceptibly at first. A few neighbors who had once turned their backs now offered nods of acknowledgement. Others, while resistant to change, could not help but notice the steadfast confidence with which Amina carried herself. She had not only confronted prejudice, she had reshaped its impact by refusing to be diminished. Her story, though personal, began to ripple outward, influencing the subtle social fabric of her community in ways that words alone could not convey. In reflecting on the incident, Amina understood that the struggle she had endured was not unique to her alone. It mirrored the experiences of countless others who navigate a world quick to assign blame based on appearances or assumptions. Her victory was symbolic, a demonstration that dignity, courage, and moral clarity could prevail even in the face of entrenched bias. But it was also deeply personal, rooted in the intimate knowledge that she had risen to meet her trial and had emerged whole. She often returned in thought to the precise moment when she had confronted the neighbor and stood her ground. The fear, the adrenaline, the temptation to retreat, it all came flooding back in vivid recollection. And yet, what defined her was not the fear itself, but the decision she had made in that moment, to act with integrity, to speak her truth, and to refuse to let injustice define her life. That choice became a guiding principle, one she carried forward into every interaction, every challenge, and every decision that followed. Amina's transformation was subtle, but profound. She no longer allowed whispers, glances, or assumptions to dictate her mood or self-worth. She had internalized a truth that many take a lifetime to understand. The power to uphold one's dignity resides within, not in the approval or recognition of others. And from that understanding flowed a deep sense of empowerment, a clarity of purpose, and an unwavering commitment to living a life aligned with her values. Looking back, the incident revealed more than injustice. It revealed the strength of the human spirit and the power of moral courage. Amina's journey demonstrated that adversity, while painful, could catalyze growth, self-realization, and transformation. It was a reminder that every challenge faced with integrity was not simply a trial, but a step toward greater resilience and influence. As she shared her story with friends, family, and eventually her children, Amina emphasized the lessons she had learned. Courage is a choice, dignity is non-negotiable, and resilience is forged in the moments when the world seems determined to break you. Her narrative was no longer merely about surviving an unfair accusation. It was about inspiring others to recognize their own strength, to act with integrity, and to challenge injustice wherever it arises. The lasting impact of that day stretched far beyond the confines of her home or neighborhood. It became a personal manifesto, a touchstone for self-respect, and a quiet yet undeniable influence on those who witnessed it. Her life, once defined by routine, now bore the mark of someone who had faced adversity and transformed it into empowerment, not for notoriety, but for truth, justice, and the enduring affirmation of human dignity. And as Amina tucked her children into bed that night, the lessons crystallized in her heart. The world may attempt to judge, to diminish, to frighten, but courage and resilience cannot be stolen. They reside within, nurtured by choices, actions, and an unwavering commitment to truth. She had survived the storm, not merely intact, but renewed, ready to face any future challenge with clarity, strength, and unwavering integrity. The story concluded not with anger or revenge, but with reflection and hope. Amina understood that the fight for justice and dignity was ongoing, yet the triumph lay in knowing that she had met her test with courage. The final lesson was unmistakable. When the world doubts your worth, it is your courage that proves it. When prejudice seeks to define you, it is your integrity that defies it. And when fear threatens to silence you, it is your voice and your choices that write your legacy. And the question lingered in the minds of those who heard her story, a call to reflection and action. How will you stand when the world underestimates your strength? And what legacy will your courage leave behind?